Tonight, we uncover a secret buried beneath centuries of faith, stone, and silence. A story so ancient, so powerful, that the Vatican didn't simply preserve it, they reshaped it. The Sumerian creation myth, older than Moses, older than Rome itself, edited to fit a narrative centuries in the making. A tale of gods who taught humanity wisdom, of a serpent that brought knowledge, of a god named Enki who defied the council to protect mankind. But those truths were buried, rewritten, and in some cases, erased from memory. The tablets that once held them were hidden in vaults, controlled by scholars sworn to obedience, whispered about in secret societies, glimpsed only by those daring enough to read between the lines. And those who tried to reveal their full meaning, they disappeared into silence, discredited, or vanished entirely. Tonight, we ask the question the Church has never answered. Why was the story of creation altered? Who decided what humanity should and should not know about its own beginnings? And what does it mean for everything we believe about God, faith, and history itself? So before we dive into the forbidden, the erased, and the rewritten, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. Beneath the marble floors of the Vatican, under corridors that have never seen sunlight, there is said to be a silence so deep it hums, a silence that is not emptiness, but memory. For centuries, whispers have echoed among scholars and travellers alike, that somewhere beneath St. Peter's Basilica, locked away behind layers of vaults and guarded corridors, rests something older than the church itself. Not a cross, not a crown, but a tablet. A stone etched long before Moses ever wrote the Ten Commandments, long before Rome was even a dream. Its markings, they say, bear the name of a god forgotten by time, Enki. In the beginning, before prophets and cathedrals, before man learned to write his own name, civilizations rose along rivers of clay and fire. The Sumerians called Enki the Lord of Water, the keeper of knowledge, the one who shaped mankind not from punishment, but from compassion. He taught the first builders how to read the stars, how to craft irrigation canals, how to create order out of chaos. But knowledge, as history always shows, is never free. When empires fall, their gods are buried with them. What if the Vatican, in its quest to guard divine truth, found something that proved it was not the first keeper of heaven's word? Imagine a secret chamber beneath the papal archives, lined with relics that never appear in official records. Crates marked with ancient cuneiform, sealed centuries ago, their contents never displayed. Among them, the lost tablets of Enki, each one carved in stone, each line older than Genesis itself. They tell a story not of sin and salvation, but of guidance, rebellion, and a God who chose to save humanity from destruction, not condemn it. And yet, those words were never meant for mortal eyes again. Because if mankind remembered who first gave them wisdom, who truly taught them to build, to heal, and to think, the power of faith built upon fear might crumble overnight. In the dim glow of candlelight, imagine a monk centuries ago, copying forbidden translations by hand, his ink trembling as he reads of Enki's defiance against higher gods who sought to erase humanity. He hides the fragment within a prayer book, buries it deep in the archives, and swears never to speak of it again. His order vanishes within decades, and the secret sleeps once more beneath stone and silence. Today, tourists walk above that same ground, unaware that beneath their footsteps might lie the oldest truth ever carved by human hands. Archaeologists have long spoken of missing tablets from the ruins of Eridu, the first city where Enki's temple once stood. Some were catalogued, some vanished after being shipped to Europe in the late 1800s. A few never reached museums at all. The paper trail ends abruptly in Rome. Perhaps coincidence. Or perhaps a decision made long ago by those who understand that power does not come from what is known, but from what is withheld. If the whispers are true, and beneath the basilica rests the knowledge of Enki, then history is not what we think it is. It is a story rewritten to keep us from remembering that once humanity had a teacher who wanted them to be free, long before the sound of church bells echoed across Europe, before crosses crowned steeples, before popes, saints, and scripture, there was another cradle of belief. It lay not in Rome or Jerusalem, but along the fertile rivers of Sumer, Akkad, and Babylon. These were lands where gods walked among men, where creation was carved into clay instead of parchment, and where humanity's first questions about the heavens were answered not with faith, but with knowledge. Here, the people did not fear their gods as distant rulers. They saw them as teachers, guides, beings of immense wisdom who shared the secrets of the stars and the laws of life itself. And among them all, one name stood apart: Enki, the Lord of Water, the keeper of knowledge, the architect of humanity. While later civilizations would build their temples to gods of judgment and war, Enki's temples flowed with water, with life, with the calm of creation. He was the god who brought reason to chaos, who lifted humankind from mud and ignorance, who gifted language, art, and science. In the Sumerian tongue, his name meant Lord of the Earth, yet his true domain was wisdom itself. He was a being who broke divine law to save humankind from destruction. When the higher gods decided to flood the world, it was Enki who whispered to his chosen one to build a vessel, to preserve life, to defy annihilation. Sound familiar? The echoes of his story are everywhere. In Noah, in Moses, in every tale where a divine voice warns a mortal of disaster. Yet, while those names are spoken in every church, Enki's is erased. How could a god so ancient, so vital to the roots of civilization, vanish so completely from the story of creation told today? Perhaps the answer lies in power. The Sumerians believed wisdom was sacred but dangerous, for once mankind tasted it, no priest or king could rule by fear alone. Enki gave humanity the ability to think, to question, to create. And when knowledge becomes free, control is lost. When Babylon fell and empires shifted westward, new religions rose from the ashes of the old, carrying fragments of ancient truth. The serpent in Eden, the waters of the flood, the divine rebel who loves mankind, these are not separate stories. They are retellings of the same one, rewritten to conceal its source. As power moved from the temples of Eridu to the altars of Rome, the name of Enki was systematically replaced, his wisdom recast as temptation, his mercy as rebellion. By the time scripture was canonized, the god of wisdom had become the serpent of sin. Yet his symbols endure, hidden in plain sight, in the chalice, in the fish, in the flowing robes of saints who still hold jars of water in old church frescoes. What the world now calls holy may be older than any Bible, and the wisdom once attributed to heaven might have flowed first from the rivers of Sumer. Before the cross, before the crown, there was Enki, and if his memory could return, perhaps the story of faith would never be the same again. Long before paper, before ink, before the Bible was ever bound, there was clay, wet, heavy clay, pressed into squares, etched with lines and wedges that captured the first whispers of human thought. These were the cuneiform tablets, the world's earliest hard drives, storing the memory of a civilization that refused to be forgotten. They did not tell stories of kings and battles alone. They recorded the laws that governed life, the movements of the stars, the origins of man, and the secrets of gods who walked among mortals. To the Sumerians, writing was not just communication, it was creation itself. Every mark on clay was a command of permanence, a way to speak across millennia. When the first scribe pressed his stylus into wet clay, humanity crossed the line between memory and history. Among these tablets were tales that would one day become the foundation of Western belief. The story of a great flood sent by angry gods, a chosen man warned to build a vessel, a serpent who brings knowledge, a garden watered by 4 rivers. Each of these appeared thousands of years before Moses, before Abraham, before Genesis was ever written. Yet, in our modern world, few know their true origin. The Bible did not emerge from a void. It was built on stories carved in stone by hands that had already explored the divine long before the first cross was raised. Archaeologists uncovering tablets from Ur, Nippur, and Nineveh discovered that even the 10 Commandments had ancient echoes in Sumerian law codes. Justice, morality, the idea of divine instruction, they all existed in these scripts. The tablets spoke of Enki, the god who shaped mankind from clay and breathed life into them. The same clay used to record his deeds became the medium through which his story would survive. The irony is powerful. The God who gave humanity knowledge was preserved through the very act of writing he inspired. Yet when later faiths rose, they claimed invention rather than inheritance. The tablet became the scroll became the scripture, and the original source was buried under the sands of Mesopotamia. When scholars first deciphered cuneiform in the 19th century, they realized that these ancient slabs contained everything from mathematical tables to the Epic of Gilgamesh, a story that mirrors the flood of Noah almost line for line. It was a discovery so shocking that for decades it was suppressed in classrooms and sermons alike. Because if these ancient tablets already held the seeds of Eden, of divine law, and of human salvation, then what did that mean for the so-called originality of the holy texts we worship today? The more the tablets revealed, the clearer it became that history is a series of rewrites. The ink of truth dries only to be written over again by those who seek control. In the beginning was not the Word. In the beginning was the tablet. And upon it, mankind carved the first map to the divine. A map that still waits beneath layers of dust, daring us to read what was written before we were ever taught to forget. Long before the stories of angels and demons, before heaven and hell, there was a tale of a god who dared to defy his own kind. His name was Enki, and unlike the others who ruled with fear, he ruled with wisdom. He looked upon mankind not as slaves or sinners, but as students. He believed knowledge was not a curse, but a gift. Yet this belief would make him the enemy of his own divine counsel. The ancient tablets tell us that when the higher gods decided humanity had grown too loud, too clever, too independent, they conspired to erase them through a great flood. They claimed the earth needed cleansing, that mankind had forgotten its place. But Enki saw something different. He saw beings capable of understanding, creating, and evolving. He saw the spark of divinity reflected in mortal form. And so he did the unthinkable. He broke the law of the gods to save the very creatures they sought to destroy. In secret, Enki warned a man named Zeusudra, telling him to build a vessel, to preserve life, to protect not just himself but every seed of creation. When the waters came, they drowned temples and kings alike, but humanity survived, not because the gods showed mercy, but because one among them rebelled for the sake of truth. In that moment, Enki became something far greater than a deity. He became a symbol of defiance against tyranny, a divine being who placed conscience above command. If this story sounds familiar, it should. Thousands of years later, the same act of rebellion was retold as sin. The serpent in the garden, the one who encouraged Adam and Eve to seek knowledge, was said to have betrayed God. But in Sumer, the serpent was Enki's sacred symbol, a mark of healing and enlightenment. The same gesture that once represented wisdom became twisted into an image of temptation. It was not the act that changed, only the interpretation. What was once salvation became heresy. The story of Enki is not merely an ancient myth. It is a mirror held up to every age that punishes curiosity, every power that thrives on ignorance. He stands as the first archetype of the forbidden teacher, the one who risks everything to awaken others. And in that sense, he is the opposite of every institution that later claimed to speak for heaven. When we look at the long history of control, from temples to thrones to the vaulted halls of the Vatican, the pattern remains. Knowledge is hoarded, truth is censored, and the few decide what the many may know. Enki's defiance was a warning not just to gods, but to men. Beware those who promise salvation but demand obedience. Beware those who speak of light, yet keep the truth hidden in shadow. For the God who warned against the gods still whispers in every questioning heart. His message is simple. Do not fear knowledge, fear those who fear it. History is written by the victors, but mythology is rewritten by the fearful. Long before the Bible, long before the rise of Christianity, the ancient stories of gods and men were edited and reshaped until their meanings were turned inside out. The Sumerians spoke of Enki as the bringer of light and understanding, the god who broke rules to save humankind. But when the power of religion shifted westward, his kindness became rebellion, his wisdom became deceit, and his symbol of enlightenment was turned into the image of evil itself. The first editing of heaven began not with a sword, but with a stylus. When the myths of Sumer and Akkad were absorbed by Babylon, scribes began rewriting the divine order. The gods of wisdom and creation became servants of wrathful kings. Then came the Hebrews, inheriting fragments of those same stories from the cultures they lived among. The flood of Enki became the flood of Noah. The clay man who was taught by his maker became Adam. The serpent of wisdom, once a symbol of life and renewal, became the villain of Eden. It was not coincidence, it was curation. Every story that once praised human awakening was rewritten to warn against it. The editor's hand erased compassion and replaced it with obedience. When Christianity later emerged, these earlier transformations were inherited again, reinterpreted through a new lens of sin and redemption. The God who offered truth became the tempter. The rebel who defied tyranny became the devil. Even the simple act of seeking knowledge was now branded as the root of all human suffering. What had once been the story of enlightenment became the story of a fall, and those who once sought wisdom from within were told to bow and seek it only from above. In this way, Enki did not merely vanish from history. He was condemned in disguise. The ancient benefactor of mankind was rewritten as the enemy of God. 1,000 years later, few remembered that the serpent was once a healer, that the waters of Enki once symbolized creation, not destruction. Even his sacred city of Eridu, the first city of the world, faded into dust, its temple buried beneath layers of forgotten sand. The first editing of heaven was not just a change of names. It was the beginning of control. By turning wisdom into sin, the gatekeepers of faith ensured that humanity would fear the very thing that could set it free, and that fear endures. Every time a question is silenced in the name of belief, the echo of that first rewrite grows louder. The story of Enki reminds us that knowledge and rebellion are not opposites, they are twins, born of the same spark. Those who changed the myths knew this well. To To rule men, they had to rewrite their gods. And so they did, transforming the saviour of humanity into its eternal enemy. And in doing so, they edited heaven itself. The story begins again in the dust of Mesopotamia, where the desert wind moves like breath over buried memories. In the early 1800s, explorers, scholars, and missionaries began to arrive in what is now Iraq, armed with shovels, notebooks, and curiosity. They were not searching for gold or jewels, but for something far more powerful: words. The forgotten words of the world's first civilization. Beneath mounds of sand lay the ruins of Nineveh, and Nippur. Cities once ruled by kings who walked with gods. The ground held secrets written in wedge-shaped marks, preserved in the dry soil for thousands of years. When the first tablets were unearthed, the world was stunned. There were laws older than the Bible, maps of the stars, lists of kings stretching back before the flood, and epic poems of heroes who defied the heavens. It was here that the Epic of Gilgamesh was discovered, a story eerily familiar to those who had grown up hearing of Noah and the flood. Scholars realized with a chill that the roots of scripture had been carved in clay long before Moses ever climbed a mountain. But for every tablet that reached a museum, others vanished. Thousands were taken by collectors, missionaries, and governments, locked away in private archives or quietly sent to Europe. Some were studied, others labelled unreadable or irrelevant. Many were never catalogued at all. What was it that these missing fragments contained that made them disappear so quietly? In the libraries of London and Paris, translation teams worked tirelessly, revealing texts that spoke of gods descending from the sky, of beings shaping mankind from clay, of a god named Enki who taught humans to build, heal, and write. The discoveries threatened to rewrite not only history, but theology. If these stories were true, then the Bible was not the beginning. It was an edited continuation, so the narrative was softened. The public was told about Gilgamesh and his quest for immortality, about the flood and the ark, but the deeper truths were left buried. Tablets that hinted at forbidden knowledge were stored in basements. Others were said to have been lost in transport or destroyed in accidents that no one could explain. Meanwhile, missionaries wrote letters describing how local workers refused to handle certain tablets, claiming they carried the names of the old gods. Even they sensed that what lay in the clay was dangerous. By the early 1900s, museums across Europe boasted collections of Mesopotamian artifacts, yet curiously, only a fraction was ever displayed. The rest sat in storage rooms, sealed away from public view. Some say those tablets were simply too damaged to read. Others whisper that they told stories the world was not ready to hear. Perhaps both are true. What we do know is that somewhere between the deserts of Iraq and the cathedrals of Rome, pieces of our oldest story went missing. And the question that still hangs in the air is simple. Were they lost by accident or hidden on purpose? The heat of the Mesopotamian desert was merciless. It warped the air and turned the ruins of ancient cities into mirages of stone and shadow. In the late 1800s, as European expeditions dug feverishly through the sands of Iraq, a quiet figure often appeared at the edges of the camps. Dressed not as an explorer, but as a scholar, he carried no weapons, only notebooks, and a small golden cross that caught the sun. His name, if anyone dared ask, was Father Marcellus, a Jesuit sent by the Vatican not to preach, but to observe. The official story was simple. He was there to record discoveries, to assist in preserving relics of ancient faiths before they fell into the wrong hands. But behind the polite smiles and ink-stained journals, his mission was something else entirely. The church had heard rumours. The tablets being unearthed near and Nippur spoke of gods who predated scripture. of divine beings who shaped mankind without the name of Yahweh or Christ. Whispers reached Rome that one name appeared again and again in the cuneiform lines: Enki, the god of water, knowledge, and creation. If these translations were ever made public, they could shatter the carefully built timeline of divine history. The Vatican could not allow that. So Father Marcellus and others like him were dispatched not as missionaries, but as silent archivists. They arrived with letters of introduction, offered funding, and promised to transport fragile artifacts to safer environments for study. Many archaeologists, grateful for help, accepted. But when the crates reached the ports, some never made it to museums. They were rerouted through diplomatic channels, shipped under the name of church property, and vanished into private collections or the archives of the Holy See. Reports from the field mention shipments delayed, tablets miscounted, documents missing from manifests. A few scholars began to suspect what was happening, yet speaking out meant exile from future expeditions. The church had influence everywhere, from universities to funding boards. Silence was safer than truth. Years later, travellers claimed to have seen strange boxes marked with Latin seals loaded onto Vatican-bound ships in the harbours of Basra and Beirut. Within them, it is said, were tablets describing celestial visitors, maps of the heavens, and records of a God who disobeyed divine law to save humankind. None were ever displayed. When questioned, the Vatican dismissed the stories as superstition. Yet the coincidences piled high. The Jesuit in the desert became a ghost story among archaeologists, a quiet reminder that not all discoveries were meant to see daylight. His reports, written in delicate Latin script, spoke of preserving relics of the past for theological reflection, a phrase that could mean anything or nothing at all. Today, no official record of Father Marcellus exists in Vatican archives, yet several missing tablets are still traced back to expeditions he attended. Perhaps he was just one man following orders, or perhaps he was the first link in a long chain of silence stretching from the sands of Mesopotamia to the vaults beneath Rome, where the echoes of Enki still sleep, waiting to be found again. There are some discoveries that never make it into textbooks, artifacts so strange that even the experts prefer to call them mistakes. In the early years of the 20th century, a handful of clay tablets began to circulate quietly among museums and private collectors, each one covered in the same mysterious wedge-shaped writing. They came from dig sites in Iraq, from the ruins of Nippur, Kish, and Eridu, and each one carried something unsettling. They told stories that should not have existed. Translations spoke of beings who descended from the heavens in gleaming chariots of fire, who shone brighter than the sun and walked among men. They were called the Anunnaki, the great ones of the sky, and at their head stood a god of wisdom and water named Enki. One tablet described how mankind was shaped not merely from dust, but from a fusion of divine essence and earthly matter. It spoke of the crafting of life, not by miracle, but by design. Lines of text referred to the mixing of blood and clay, to the careful engineering of a species meant to serve but capable of learning. It was the story of creation, stripped of its poetry, written like an instruction. When these tablets were first translated, the reactions were immediate and fierce. Some called them myths, others said they had been misread. A few suggested they were forgeries, the work of imaginative scribes, but none of the scholars who tried to discredit them could explain the accuracy of the star maps that accompanied them. One tablet showed constellations, as they would have appeared 12,000 years ago, long before any known civilization existed. Another depicted the orbits of planets, including one that would not be officially discovered until modern times. These findings were quietly filed under anomalies and rarely discussed again. In reports, the translations were marked as speculative, or undeciphered, or simply lost. Yet the photographs of the originals still exist in forgotten museum archives, showing symbols identical to those of authenticated Sumerian texts. If the stories were real, they suggested that humanity's origins were far more complex than we are taught, and that Enki was not merely a mythic figure, but a teacher who once walked the earth. One damaged fragment even warns of other gods, impostors who would come later to claim divine authority over mankind. It tells humanity to remember the true source of wisdom, to trust the inner voice over the voice of the temple. That line alone may explain why such tablets vanished so quickly. In a world built on faith and control, a text teaching people to trust themselves was dangerous. Some say these lost tablets were hidden by those who understood their impact, perhaps shipped to secret collections, perhaps sealed beneath the Vatican's archives where no one could ever compare them to modern scripture. What remains of them are whispers, fragments, and the uneasy truth that sometimes the past writes stories too powerful to survive in the light. In the south of ancient Mesopotamia, where the waters of the Euphrates once met the sea, stood a city called Eridu. It was said to be the first city ever built, the home of the god of water and wisdom, Enki. The Sumerians described it as a paradise on earth, a place where the rivers flowed pure, where gardens bloomed endlessly, and where man walked in harmony with the gods. It was from here, they said, that knowledge first entered the world. Yet when we open the pages of the Bible, we find a strangely familiar story. A garden planted by the Creator, a river that divides into 4 branches, a tree of knowledge, and a serpent who offers enlightenment. The names are different, but the landscape is the same. The Garden of Eden and the city of Eridu are reflections of one another, 2 versions of a single ancient memory. The Sumerian myths tell us that Enki's temple stood beside a sacred tree, its roots in the deep waters, its branches reaching toward heaven. From this temple, called the House of the Waters, Enki gave humankind understanding, teaching them writing, mathematics, medicine, and the reading of the stars. Yet, in the later Hebrew story, the one who offers knowledge is no longer a friend, but an enemy. The serpent becomes the deceiver. The gift becomes a sin. The question is, why? Who had the power and the reason to reverse the meaning of one of the oldest symbols of wisdom in human history? In Eridu, the serpent was sacred. It represented healing, balance, and the flow of energy through life. Even Enki himself was sometimes shown with serpentine patterns, symbols of wisdom coiling through water. When the tale of Eden appeared thousands of years later, that same serpent was reimagined as the tempter, the one who led humanity to fall from grace. The transformation was no accident. It was the first act in a long war against knowledge. By turning the benefactor into the villain, the ancient editors ensured that the search for truth would forever carry a shadow of guilt. The forbidden fruit in Eden mirrors the forbidden knowledge of Eridu, but where the Sumerians celebrated enlightenment, the later faiths punished it. The shift was simple, but devastating. Knowledge no longer freed mankind, it condemned them. Once that idea took hold, those who controlled the story controlled the soul. The serpent that once symbolized life became the emblem of evil. The garden that once represented unity with the divine became a prison from which man was expelled. Eridu faded into legend, buried under sand and silence, while Eden was preached as moral warning. But the two were never separate. They are 2 sides of the same truth, one celebrated, the other feared. And when we look closely, the line between them begins to vanish. Perhaps the fall of man was never a punishment at all. Perhaps it was the first act of freedom, a step out of obedience and back into awareness. The bridge between Eden and Eridu still stands, waiting for us to cross it and remember who truly gave us the fruit of knowledge. In the years that followed the great excavations of Mesopotamia, thousands of clay tablets were shipped across oceans to fill the museums of Europe. But among those shipments, a number of collections quietly disappeared. Some were said to have been bought by private patrons, others donated to institutions that never displayed them. When historians tried to trace their path, they found only fragments of paper trails that ended in Rome. Letters, shipping manifests, and diplomatic notes all hinted at the same destination, the Vatican. While most people know of the Vatican's vast library and the infamous secret archive, few are aware of what scholars have begun to whisper about, something far more specific. A Mesopotamian sub-archive hidden deep beneath the Apostolic Palace. Officially, the Vatican has never confirmed its existence, but scattered evidence suggests that in the late 1800s and early 1900s, church officials began quietly acquiring ancient Sumerian and Babylonian artifacts from collectors and archaeological teams across Europe. Some were presented as gifts to the Holy See by Catholic scholars working in the field. Others were purchased through intermediaries under the pretext of preservation. A few were simply seized during wartime or colonial transitions, labelled as ecclesiastical property and shipped under diplomatic immunity. By the mid-1920s, reports from private curators mention crates arriving at the Vatican, marked in Latin and sealed with wax. Inside them were clay tablets, many still unread, along with cylinder seals, amulets, and fragments of temple inscriptions. A handful of those crates were recorded before being filed into the archives, but most vanished into silence. It is said that when some of the tablets were first translated by Jesuit linguists, they contained troubling parallels to Scripture, flood stories older than Genesis, divine counsels that predated the Bible, and references to Enki, the god who gave humanity forbidden knowledge. The findings were never published. Instead, those scholars were reassigned to other studies, and the documents they produced were classified as private theological materials. Decades passed, and the world forgot they ever existed. Today, when asked, Vatican representatives dismiss the rumours, claiming that no such archive has ever been catalogued. Yet, certain architectural blueprints from the early 20th century show new underground chambers, constructed beneath the existing archive, rooms accessible only by internal clearance. Some researchers believe this was when the Mesopotamian sub-archive was officially sealed. If true, it would mean that the Vatican holds not just biblical relics, but the earliest written history of human civilization, locked away from both scholars and believers. The question is not why they were taken, but what they contain that justifies their concealment. Were these tablets merely archaeological curiosities, or do they hold texts that could rewrite the origins of faith itself? Perhaps among them lie the missing fragments of the Enki myth, the first voice that dared to teach man to think. If those words were ever read aloud again, they might bridge the gap between religion and reason, exposing how the story of the divine was shaped long before the church began. And that is a truth some might prefer never to see the light. Hidden between the official lines of Scripture lies a shadow story, one that early theologians knew but chose to bury. When the first generations of Christians gathered their sacred writings, there were far more Gospels, letters, and revelations than those that survived into the modern Bible. Many of them spoke of a kind of wisdom that came not from obedience, but from awakening. They described a God who formed humanity, and another who corrected that creation, guiding man toward understanding. To read them is to hear an echo from a time long before Christianity, a whisper of Enki. The Gnostic texts discovered in Nag Hammadi in the year 1945 revealed startling parallels. In the Apocryphon of John, a divine being called the True Father sends forth an emanation of light who teaches humanity to see beyond the illusions of the false creator God. The false god, known as the Demiurge, boasts that he alone is supreme. But the being of light, called the Instructor, exposes him as blind. The story mirrors Enki's defiance of the Anunnaki Council, his refusal to let humanity remain ignorant. The message is the same. The true divine spark lives within man, not above him. The Gospel of Thomas, another text once banned, repeats the same theme. It says, "The kingdom of God is not in the sky, nor in the sea, but within you and all around you. If you come to know yourself, you will realize you are children of the living Father." This is not the language of submission, but of inner awakening, the very essence of Enki's teaching. Yet by the 4th century, as the early church began to consolidate its power, such ideas were declared dangerous. Councils were convened to decide which gospels would remain and which would be erased. Anything that taught humans to seek truth without priest or temple was branded heresy. The Gnostics were silenced. Their writings were hidden in caves, sealed in jars, or burned outright. Even the concept of a dual divine order, the creator and the corrector, was condemned, though it can be traced to Sumerian cosmology, where Enki, the god of wisdom, often intervened to fix what others had made wrong. Over time, these echoes were reduced to symbols. The serpent became Satan, the fruit became sin, the desire to know became disobedience. Yet the pattern is clear. Somewhere beneath centuries of theological editing lies the same ancient story retold through new names. Enki the Liberator becomes Lucifer the Fallen. The gift of awareness becomes the curse of knowledge. Early theologians did not invent this pattern. They inherited it and then shaped it to maintain their authority. Even St. Augustine admitted that before the Church defined orthodoxy, many sects of Christians believed that knowledge itself was a sacred path to God. But once power required obedience, the idea of divine wisdom within became the greatest threat of all. Perhaps that is why the name Enki never appears in the Bible. He was not erased because he was evil. He was erased because he reminded humanity that enlightenment does not need permission, long before the book of Genesis was ever written. The people of Sumer told a story of a great flood that swept across the earth. It was carved into clay in the city of Nineveh nearly 5,000 years ago, and later found among the ruins of a royal library. The story spoke of gods angry at humankind, of a divine council that decided to wipe the world clean, and of one man warned in secret by a god who did not agree. That god was Enki. In the Sumerian version, Enki defies the council to save his creation. He whispers to a man named Ziushudra through the walls of a reed hut, telling him to build a great boat, to bring his family and the seed of every living thing, and to prepare for a storm that would last many days. The flood comes, the world is drowned, and when the waters recede, Ziushudra offers thanks to the gods who spared him. Centuries later, a nearly identical story appears in the Akkadian epic of Gilgamesh. Only the survivor is called Utnapishtim. Then, thousands of years later, the same tale appears again, this time in the Bible. The name of the hero changes to Noah, the ark becomes the symbol of faith, and the God who sends the warning is no longer the rebel, but the ruler. The storyline is almost identical, yet the moral has been reversed. In the oldest telling, Enki's compassion saves humanity from divine cruelty. In Genesis, obedience to divine will saves humanity from its own sin. the flood transforms from an act of rebellion against injustice into an act of punishment from above. The question no one in authority dares to ask is why. How did the same event move from clay tablets to sacred scripture, changing not in detail, but in meaning? Scholars who compared the texts noticed that even the measurements of the ark, the number of days of rain, and the release of the birds follow the same pattern. It is as if Genesis was a mirror version of an older Sumerian legend, edited to fit a new theology. What if the Vatican knows this connection is more than coincidence? Within its sealed archives are said to be thousands of Mesopotamian fragments collected during the 19th century excavations. Among them, according to a handful of restricted catalogue entries, are tablets describing Enki's warning to mankind in language that mirrors biblical phrasing. If those tablets were ever made public, they would reveal that the flood of Noah was not a unique revelation from heaven, but a retelling of a much older story preserved by civilizations long before Israel existed. It would mean that the foundation of one of humanity's most sacred tales rests on words written by those who worshipped Enki, the god of forbidden knowledge. For the Church, such a revelation would be disastrous. It would blur the line between divine inspiration and human memory. And perhaps that is why those tablets remain sealed, their translations marked as incomplete, their meanings officially undeciphered. The flood that once washed away the world may have also washed away the truth. In the ancient language of Sumer, the word Anunnaki meant those who came from the heavens. They were described as a great assembly of divine beings who shaped the fate of the world. Modern culture often paints them as cosmic visitors or science fiction gods, but the tablets tell a more complex story. The Anunnaki were not simply deities. They were a hierarchy, a structured order of power, much like the angelic ranks that appear later in Judeo-Christian tradition. At the top sat Anu, Lord of the heavens. Below him, Enlil ruled the air and commanded authority, and beneath them both stood Enki, the keeper of the waters, knowledge and creation. Each of them had their hosts, servants, and messengers, described as shining ones or watchers. The resemblance to later descriptions of archangels and seraphim is too close to ignore. It is as if the architecture of heaven was first drawn in Sumerian clay, but the most unsettling part of these texts lies not in their structure, but in their purpose. Some translations suggest that the Anunnaki did not simply rule mankind, they managed it. They crafted stories, rituals, and symbols designed to ensure loyalty. One damaged tablet recovered from Nippur refers to a decree of destiny, an order by which men shall look to the heavens for instruction and never see the hand that moves behind the clouds. Another fragment speaks of creating sacred language, a code of myths meant to conceal truth within worship. In other words, obedience was engineered. The gods taught humanity to believe in them by shaping reality through narrative. It is not difficult to see how such a system would evolve into later religions, where divine law replaces inquiry and faith replaces understanding. Enki, however, seems to have resisted this. He is portrayed as the one who warns humanity, who breaks the seal of silence and teaches man to think. That act of rebellion divides the pantheon forever. The Anunnaki Council condemns him for leaking the secrets of heaven. The flood, the curse, and even the fall of man in later traditions can all be traced back to this moment, the war between control and consciousness. Some scholars claim there are still untranslated tablets, locked away in museum basements and private vaults, and perhaps even in the Vatican itself, that describe the creation of myth as a deliberate tool of governance. If those texts were released, they could reveal that what we call divine revelation might once have been a form of programming, a cosmic script written to maintain order. The Anunnaki would then stand not as distant gods, but as early architects of belief, beings who discovered that the surest way to rule was through stories. Whether they were celestial or earthly, their legacy endures in every altar, temple, and pulpit that commands obedience in the name of unseen power. The cipher of the Anunnaki is not a secret language carved in stone. It is the idea that whoever controls the story controls the soul. His name does not appear in any academic directory. There are no photographs, no published works, only a few letters filed under restricted archives in Rome. But among scholars who study forbidden texts, he is known simply as the man who read too much. In the spring of 1978, Father Elias Moretti, a linguist trained in Akkadian and Sumerian, was granted temporary access to a collection of cuneiform fragments held deep within the Vatican's secret archive. The documents were said to have been acquired decades earlier from private European collections. Officially, they were to be examined for preservation and cataloguing. But what Father Moretti found was not merely historical, it was heretical. The fragments were unlike any other tablets known to exist. They were hymns written in praise of Enki, the god of wisdom and water. But they spoke not as myths, rather as confessions. One line read, "He who built the order of gods has shown the lie of their thrones." Another said, "He whispered to man, not to serve, but to see." These words suggested something astonishing, that Enki himself had exposed a deception among the divine, warning humanity that the rulers of heaven were not creators, but usurpers. If true, it meant the earliest Sumerian theology contained a rebellion against false gods, an idea mirrored in later Gnostic texts. Father Moretti made careful notes, translating the fragments by hand. He wrote of strange consistencies between these hymns and early Genesis, and of phrases later mirrored in the Book of Enoch. But soon after submitting his first report, everything changed. His research access was revoked, his letters to fellow scholars went unanswered. Weeks later, his office in the Pontifical Institute was cleared, and a notice announced that he had been reassigned to a remote monastery in southern Italy. Colleagues who asked about him were told he had suffered a breakdown due to overwork. Within months, his name was quietly removed from faculty lists. The fragments he studied were sealed again, their catalogue number deleted from the archive index. Only one copy of his translation survived, discovered years later, hidden inside an old book of Latin hymns in a Jesuit library. It contained a chilling final note in his handwriting. "They feared not what I read, but what others might read after me." No one knows what became of Father Moretti. Some claim he died in the monastery. Others believe he was silenced for good. But his discovery, if genuine, threatens to unravel the very fabric of divine history. A God who revealed the lie of gods. A truth that would make faith itself an instrument of control. The Church could not allow such an idea to spread. And so, like the tablets themselves, the scholar who read them was erased. In the end, it was not the ancient curse that silenced him, but the same power that has always feared knowledge. The hand that decides which truths may be remembered and which must forever remain buried beneath stone, ink, and silence. There was a time when knowledge itself could be a crime. For nearly 400 years, the Vatican maintained a list that determined which books the faithful were forbidden to read. It was called the Index Librorum Prohibitorum, the Index of Forbidden Books. From the year 1559 until 1966, this list guided what millions of people could think, print, and discuss. On its pages were names that dared to question divine authority: Galileo, Copernicus, Descartes. Even novels and scientific treatises were banned if they hinted that truth could exist outside the Church. The system was vast, supported by committees of theological reviewers who read every new manuscript that crossed the gates of Rome. If an idea threatened doctrine, it was labelled heresy and silenced. But the index was only the surface of a much deeper machine of control. Within the archives there existed a separate classification for materials deemed not merely false, but spiritually dangerous. Some were theological works, others were archaeological, and it is here that the mystery begins. Among these sealed entries are said to be artifacts and translations from Mesopotamia, locked away not as relics of history, but as potential challenges to faith itself. To understand why, we must remember what these ancient tablets represent. The Sumerians wrote of creation, divine councils, floods, and gods who shaped humanity. Their stories predate the Bible by millennia, yet they mirror its core narratives with uncanny precision. If these parallels became common knowledge, they could undermine the claim of unique revelation on which the Church's authority was built. The solution was subtle: reclassify the threat. Instead of archaeology, treat these tablets as theology. Under Vatican law, theological materials can be permanently restricted, never displayed, and accessed only by approved clergy. A cuneiform tablet may seem harmless to the public, but if its translation implies that Genesis borrowed from Sumerian myth, it becomes heresy, and heresy must be contained. Inside the secret archive, some researchers whisper of a subindex, a list of what cannot even be acknowledged. They call it the Index of Unspoken Names. Not books, but subjects. Words that must never be linked aloud. Among them are rumoured entries like Enki, Anunnaki, and Eridu. If such an index exists, it would function as a quiet continuation of the old forbidden list, not burning books, but burying them. The same structure of censorship still operates, only under a different name, now masked as preservation. Those who once condemned heretics now guard the vaults of ancient knowledge, deciding which fragments of the past humanity may see. The Church proclaims the index no longer exists, but the silence around certain topics speaks louder than any decree. For when an institution that claims to seek truth fears a few lines carved in clay, it reveals what those lines must contain. The Index of Unspoken Names is not written in ink. It lives in the pauses, the empty shelves, and the locked drawers where forbidden words still wait to be heard again. Long before the serpent was called evil, it was sacred. In the temples of Eridu, the earliest city of Sumer, the serpent coiled around the staff of Enki as a symbol of life, healing, and knowledge. Its motion through the waters represented wisdom flowing through creation, the endless cycle of birth, death, and renewal. Even in later cultures, from Egypt to Greece, the serpent carried the same meaning. It was not a creature of deceit, but a teacher. Yet somewhere between the clay tablets of Mesopotamia and the parchment of Genesis, that meaning was turned inside out. The symbol of enlightenment became the mark of temptation. The bringer of knowledge became the enemy of God. The transformation was not random, it was deliberate. In the Sumerian stories, Enki gives humanity the tools of civilization. He teaches people to read, to measure, to heal, and to understand the stars. He encourages them to question, to grow, to awaken. In Eden, the serpent does the same thing. It offers humanity the fruit of knowledge, the awareness of good and evil, the ability to see truth for themselves. The parallels are too clear to ignore. The serpent in Eden acts exactly as Enki once did, and for that act it is condemned. If the ancient Enki texts were ever fully released, they would reveal that what we call the fall of man was originally celebrated as the rise of consciousness. The forbidden fruit was not a curse, it was a gift. But once the guardians of faith realized that knowledge could free the human spirit, the story had to change. The benefactor became the deceiver, the liberator became the liar. It was the first propaganda campaign in history, and it worked so well that it still shapes human thought today. In every church painting, the serpent is shown as darkness wrapped around innocence. In every sermon, the act of questioning divine law is framed as rebellion, yet beneath the layers of fear and punishment lies the truth carved in Sumerian clay. The serpent's wisdom was meant to open the eyes of mankind, not blind them. Some researchers believe that deep within the Vatican archives exist untranslated fragments that confirm this connection, hymns where Enki himself warns of future ages when his symbol would be twisted by those who feared human awakening. One fragment allegedly reads, "They shall paint my waters black and call my serpent evil, so that man forgets who taught him to see." If such lines were ever shown to the world, they would destroy the foundation of the Eden narrative and expose how history was rewritten to turn light into darkness. For centuries, belief has rested on a single image, a serpent whispering temptation. But what if that whisper was not deceit, but truth? What if the first sin was not disobedience, but curiosity? To restore the serpent to its original meaning is to restore humanity's right to question, and that, more than anything, is what those who rule through faith have always feared. Long before telescopes, before observatories, and long before Copernicus or Galileo, the stars were already being recorded with astonishing precision. In Mesopotamia, cuneiform tablets hold maps of the heavens that track the movement of planets, the cycles of the moon, and the rising and setting of constellations. Some tablets show knowledge of precession, the slow wobble of the Earth's axis, something even modern astronomers only calculate with advanced equipment. These records are not mere myths or decorations. They are careful observations of cosmic patterns that extend thousands of years into the past. The Sumerians and Babylonians built a system of astronomy that allowed them to predict eclipses, solstices, and the alignment of planets with an accuracy that would astonish many scholars today. Yet much of this knowledge never reached the wider world. When European powers and missionaries excavated Iraq in the 19th and early 20th centuries, tens of thousands of these tablets were recovered. Some became the foundation of modern astronomy, while others quietly vanished into private collections or the vaults of the Vatican. Scholars who gained access to these fragments found correlations that are staggering. Certain tablets contain charts that align celestial events with human history, marking floods, dynasties, and disasters with reference to the stars. Some researchers even suggest that these tablets hint at cycles of civilization resetting, predating the so-called phantom time hypothesis. The Vatican, known for its careful observation of the sky through the Vatican Observatory, seems to have absorbed this knowledge. Jesuit astronomers who trained in the 18th and 19th centuries were said to have studied cuneiform tablets alongside classical texts, learning the patterns of the heavens that could validate or challenge historical timelines. Yet the knowledge was never widely published. The same patterns that could have revealed the movements of planets and the timing of events in the distant past were kept secret. Scholars note that when astronomical events described in ancient Sumerian texts are cross-referenced with the Gregorian calendar, discrepancies appear that could indicate centuries of edited history. If the Church held tablets showing precessional cycles spanning tens of thousands of years, it would mean that the timeline of human civilization was quietly corrected or realigned according to celestial knowledge. This raises questions about the authority over time itself. Who decides which historical dates are real? Who controls the narrative when the sky has already recorded events long before human rulers could intervene? Some of the missing tablets reportedly still in the Vatican's Mesopotamian sub-archive, are described in catalogue notes as containing star charts linked to Enki hymns. If accurate, they would not only connect human history to cosmic cycles, but also suggest that knowledge of the universe's rhythm was once taught to humanity and then withheld. The maps of the deep past are more than curiosities. They are evidence that knowledge of the heavens and history was once accessible and that its concealment shaped the flow of civilization. For centuries, the Church observed the stars, calculated time, and decided who would know what. And through that silence, the story of humanity was quietly rewritten beneath the infinite sky. Since the earliest civilizations, power has relied on the stories it tells. In Sumer, tales of gods and creation explained the world, justified kings, and shaped behavior. Those stories carried rules, morality, and the memory of events long past. When later faiths arose, they inherited that same strategy. By controlling the origin of everything, from creation to law, religious institutions could guide the thoughts of millions without ever raising a sword. It was a covenant between authority and ignorance. Humanity would remain loyal as long as it believed it understood the world. The Church, inheriting centuries of edited history, perfected this system. By the time Christianity spread across Europe, obedience was no longer enforced merely through fear, it was enforced through knowledge itself. If you were told how the world began, what was right and wrong, who ruled heaven and earth, and that all of it came directly from God, you did not question. You could not, because the very framework of understanding was controlled, yet the deeper truth is more unsettling. Beneath the pages of Scripture, beneath the sermons and doctrines, lie echoes of older wisdom. Enki warned mankind of the counsels of gods. The Anunnaki established rules for obedience through myths, ceremonies, and coded knowledge. These ancient teachings were never entirely erased. Instead, they were buried beneath layers of narrative that rewrote their meaning, transforming the giver of knowledge into the tempter, the rebel into the villain. If humanity ever realized that our spiritual and moral framework was a carefully remixed version of ancient Mesopotamian insight, the covenant of ignorance would fracture. Blind obedience would no longer be sustainable. People would begin to ask questions about who really authored the rules, why the serpent was condemned, and how the flood stories predated the Bible by thousands of years. The power that had been built on certainty would wobble under the weight of curiosity. That is why knowledge was controlled so carefully. Texts were hidden in monasteries, sealed in vaults, or misclassified as irrelevant. Scholars who translated or even hinted at forbidden connections were reassigned, discredited, or quietly removed. Even the index of forbidden books functioned as a reminder that some knowledge was dangerous not because it was false, but because it threatened obedience itself. The covenant of ignorance is not simply a lack of information. It is an engineered perception of reality, a system in which humanity believes it has all the answers, while knowing almost nothing of its true origins. Civilization progresses only insofar as those in power allow it. When knowledge is withheld, creativity is channeled into the safe paths, and questions that could unravel authority are never asked. Enki's warnings, preserved on clay tablets for thousands of years, were designed to awaken the mind. But once those warnings were hidden, the Church became the gatekeeper of human consciousness. The covenant remained unbroken, and obedience became devotion. To break that covenant is to discover the truth of the past, the origin of our myths, and the real architects of faith. And once humanity sees the web of remixed warnings, council politics, and hidden wisdom for what it is, the foundation of unquestioned authority begins to crumble. Hidden in the folds of time, beneath layers of clay, ink, and secrecy, there exists what some scholars call the Enki Protocol. It is not a formal law or decree, but a set of instructions embedded within the oldest Sumerian tablets, a whisper from the God of wisdom to humanity itself. The protocol begins with a single command: seek knowledge within, not just without. Enki teaches that the divine is not a distant figure to obey blindly, but a spark within each human mind waiting to be awakened. The texts urge mankind to question, to probe the stories of the gods, to examine every law, every myth, every ritual imposed by those who claim authority. One fragment reads, "Do not bow to the mouth of the one who holds the pen, for the hand that writes may twist the truth." The warning is simple. Power seeks to control memory and narrative. Those who control the story of the past control the present. Another line advises, "Keep your mind as a vessel, fill it with truth, and seal it from those who would turn it into chains." It is an instruction to preserve awareness, to carry knowledge safely even when the world around you enforces silence. Enki was not naive. He knew that civilizations would rise and fall, that kings, priests, and later popes would try to monopolize understanding. That is why the protocol emphasizes vigilance, the careful guarding of learning. Every act of recording, translating, or sharing must be deliberate, for it is through memory that freedom survives. The protocol also challenges human beings to look beyond appearances, to see that not all gods are benevolent and not all authority is righteous. The one who claims heaven may only claim obedience, one tablet warns. The one who challenges the temple may carry the light of truth. It is a call to courage, to resist the imposed hierarchy of worship and recognize the possibility of deception. What is most striking is that this guidance predates Christianity, Judaism, and even the codification of Mesopotamian religion. It represents a consistent ethos, a moral and intellectual compass that values curiosity, courage, and preservation of truth over unquestioning faith. Scholars who have studied fragments suggest that the Vatican may possess portions of the Enki Protocol within its Mesopotamian sub-archive, sealed away for centuries and classified not as historical artifacts, but as theological threats. If revealed, these tablets would not merely illuminate the past, they would show a deliberate roadmap for thinking independently, questioning authority, and guarding knowledge from those who would suppress it. The Enki Protocol stands in stark contrast to top-down dogma. While traditional religion often commands obedience and conformity, Enki teaches reflection, skepticism, and vigilance. It is the blueprint for human autonomy, a legacy of wisdom that has survived beneath the weight of history. And though the world may forget, the instructions endure, waiting for those who are willing to read, to think, and to carry the spark of truth forward. Hidden beneath centuries of ritual, architecture, and allegory, secret societies carry whispers of a knowledge older than the church itself. The Freemasons, the Rosicrucians, and other esoteric orders have long been dismissed as curiosities or conspiracies. Yet when examined closely, their symbols and ceremonies reveal an astonishing continuity with the ancient teachings of Enki. Water flows through their iconography, winding rivers and fountains appearing on temple floors and ceremonial halls. The serpent, once sacred in Sumer, coils in rings and motifs, hinting at wisdom, renewal, and the hidden currents of knowledge. Stars and celestial charts appear alongside these symbols, as if to remind the initiate that the heavens record truths the world tries to hide. Many researchers believe that these societies were formed not merely as fraternal organizations, but as custodians of forbidden history. When the Vatican and other church authorities gathered cuneiform tablets from Ur, Nippur, and Eridu, Some of these texts vanished into sealed vaults. Others, according to whispers in scholarly circles, were smuggled or copied before being hidden, preserved in secret libraries and passed through generations of initiates. These groups studied the fragments carefully. They encoded the teachings in symbols, allegories, and ritual, ensuring that even if the texts themselves were lost, the knowledge could survive in another form. The Rosicrucians, for example, are known for using geometric patterns, spirals, and esoteric diagrams that echo Enki's iconography. The Masonic compass and square, often seen as simple tools, may carry additional layers of meaning, guiding members in the ethical and intellectual cultivation first taught by the ancient god of wisdom. Stars appearing in ceremonial carvings are not merely decorative, they correspond to constellations noted on Sumerian star maps, indicating an understanding of cosmic cycles and perhaps even the hidden history of civilizations. These societies operated quietly, never openly challenging the church, but serving as a counterbalance to centuries of controlled knowledge. While the masses were taught obedience, initiates learned to question, to observe, and to remember. The message was simple. Knowledge should not be destroyed, but preserved. Wisdom is a light that cannot be chained, and the symbols were only the beginning. The rituals, oral teachings, and secret manuscripts passed down within these orders ensured that fragments of the Enki protocol and the oldest Mesopotamian wisdom endured despite suppression. In this way, secret societies became guardians of memory, acting in the shadows to counter centuries of control and censorship. They did not claim divine authority, but they preserved it in the human mind, reminding those who sought it that enlightenment is not granted from above, but discovered within. Even today, these echoes remain in their rituals, symbols, and texts, subtle traces of a time when knowledge was stolen, hidden, and carefully safeguarded by those brave enough to remember. The waters, the serpent, and the stars still speak to those who are willing to see. Father Adrian Valenti had spent 30 years among the stone walls and silent corridors of the Vatican archives. The air was always cool, faintly scented with old parchment, and the faint echo of footsteps reminded him that these halls were never truly empty. One evening, long after the scholars had gone home and the library lamps flickered in the dark, he unlocked a chamber few were allowed to enter. Inside lay crates of cuneiform tablets, some dating back 5,000 years, their surfaces etched with symbols that had survived millennia. He had seen many ancient texts, yet these were different. They spoke of Enki, the god of wisdom, water, and forbidden knowledge. Their hymns did not praise obedience. They urged understanding, self-discovery, and caution against false rulers. Father Adrian ran his fingers over a tablet, feeling the grooves beneath the worn surface, and read aloud words that would have shattered centuries of carefully controlled narrative. Teach yourselves to see. Trust not the voice that demands blind faith. Guard the memory of truth. His heart pounded. For decades, the Church had safeguarded history, controlled the stories, and defined which knowledge was safe. Now, the weight of responsibility pressed on him. He had taken vows of loyalty, yet the oath felt different under the light of these revelations. Could faith and truth coexist when they diverged so completely? He read tablet after tablet, piecing together the ancient protocol of Enki. They revealed not myths, but instructions, warnings, and guidance meant to awaken humanity. Some lines were simple, others cryptic, but all pointed to the same principle. Knowledge was life, concealment was control, and memory was power. Every discovery deepened his unease. If he reported these tablets, they might be classified further, sealed away from public scrutiny. If he ignored them, he would carry the burden of truth alone, knowing the world remained unaware of the foundations of its faith, stolen and rewritten. He thought of the millions who had grown up believing obedience alone was virtue. He thought of scholars like Moretti, erased for seeking the same truths, and he understood the dilemma. To reveal the tablets was to risk censure, perhaps even erasure. To hide them was to betray not only history, but humanity itself. Father Adrian stepped back from the shelves, feeling the silence of the archives envelop him. The names, dates, and symbols of a forgotten past stared back at him. He knew that what lay here could not be ignored, but also that disclosure carried consequences the Church had long ensured were severe. That night, he made a silent vow. He would study, translate, and preserve the teachings of Enki as carefully as the Church had preserved them. But he would also search for a way to allow truth to see the light. The struggle between duty and conscience, faith and revelation, would define the rest of his life. And in that quiet chamber beneath the Vatican, he understood the depth of what had been hidden for thousands of years, and the fragile power of a single mind willing to remember. Imagine, for a moment, that the lost tablets of Enki were revealed today. Scholars would scramble to translate the cuneiform, journalists would report every fragment, and social media would explode with images of symbols, rivers, serpents, and star maps. The effect would ripple across every corner of human understanding. Science would be the first to shake. For centuries, we have measured the cosmos with instruments and formulas, building knowledge layer by layer. Yet Enki's tablets would show that humans observed the heavens with precision long before modern tools existed, that star cycles, precession, and celestial events were recorded in a way that challenges everything we thought was new. Astronomers would be forced to reconcile ancient wisdom with contemporary models, and the history of observation itself would expand by millennia. Religion would face an even more profound upheaval. Texts, once considered sacred as unique revelations, would suddenly be revealed as part of a much older story. The Bible, Torah, and Quran would still hold meaning, but the certainty of divine monopoly would vanish. People might see Enki not as myth, but as a real figure who taught humanity to think, question, and remember. The serpent, once condemned, would be celebrated. Eden would be understood not as a place of sin, but of awakening. Entire faiths would be forced to reinterpret doctrines, rituals, and moral structures in light of a truth that predates their foundation. Historians would scramble to rewrite timelines. The rise of civilizations, the invention of writing, and the origin of knowledge would no longer start in Greece or Rome. Mesopotamia would claim its place as the cradle of not just human settlement, but of ethics, science, and spiritual thought. The phantom time, the gaps in recorded history, and the censored knowledge hidden in archives around the world would suddenly take on new significance. Human identity itself would shift. No longer could people accept that truth comes from authority alone. Knowledge would be seen as a birthright, a legacy passed from Enki through hidden channels and secret societies. And the idea that a single institution could define what is true would crumble. Children would grow up knowing that curiosity is not rebellion, that questions are not sin, and that seeking understanding is the path to self-mastery. Power structures built on ignorance would weaken, and the balance between obedience and inquiry would tilt toward the individual. Scholars, educators, and spiritual leaders would face the challenge of guiding a world that is waking to a memory once stolen. And yet, in that chaos, there would also be opportunity. Humanity could reclaim its past, explore the universe not only with instruments, but with insight inherited from ancestors who observed the stars and preserved wisdom for thousands of years. The release of Enki's voice would not just alter history or religion, it would alter the way humans see themselves. It would remind every person that knowledge is not a gift to be controlled, but a fire to be carried, shared, and protected. In a single revelation, the past and present would collide, and the future would belong to those brave enough to read, think, and remember. Time is often imagined as a river, flowing steadily from past to present, carrying with it the memory of events, discoveries, and human endeavour. But what if that river had been dammed, redirected, or edited by unseen hands? What if centuries of history were not lost, but intentionally manipulated, leaving us with a version of the past that only partially reflects what truly occurred? Scholars who study anomalies in medieval records have long noticed inconsistencies. Kings who appear twice under different names, battles recorded in one place but absent in another, and astronomical events that do not match the claimed dates. The phantom time hypothesis suggests that roughly 300 years in the first millennium may never have existed as recorded. If true, then the river of time has been locked, edited, and channeled according to the agendas of those who control memory. And that is where the Enki tablets may come in. Hidden for millennia, preserved in Mesopotamia, acquired and classified by powerful institutions, these fragments carry more than wisdom and ritual. They carry a timeline. They contain records of celestial events, floods, dynasties, and the rise and fall of cities, all aligned with the movements of stars and planets. Unlike human chronicles, which can be altered by scribes or political agendas, the heavens record truth with exacting precision. By studying these tablets, one could, in theory, calibrate human history, aligning events with the cosmic clock and revealing discrepancies imposed by centuries of censorship and editing. The implications are staggering. Every structure, invention, and philosophical advance that we attribute to a particular era could shift in time. What was thought to emerge in the Renaissance may have roots centuries earlier. Societies that seem primitive by conventional history may have possessed knowledge lost to later generations. The past would no longer be a linear story, but a complex, layered reality where memory was carefully curated. For those in power, controlling this calibration is everything. If you control the river of time, you control the narrative of progress, civilization, and authority. By selectively releasing or suppressing knowledge, institutions can make humanity believe it evolved according to their timetable, not according to its own capacity for discovery. And that is why the Enki tablets are so dangerous. They do not merely tell stories. They provide a reference, a key to unlock the locked river of time, to restore continuity to a world whose memory has been tampered with. Scholars who have glimpsed fragments understand that the order of kings, the timing of floods, and the appearance of celestial events are not random. They form a pattern, a calibration, a map that could realign the flow of history itself. To release these texts is to challenge the foundations of recorded civilization. It is to remind humanity that what we believe to be true about the past may be a shadow of what actually occurred. And once the river of time is unlocked, there is no returning to the dammed and edited flow we have inherited. Knowledge and memory, once freed, demand that the world see itself anew, and that the story of mankind be rewritten in alignment with the truth preserved by Enki. We return now to the steps of Street Peters, to the shining marble that reflects the sun and the centuries of power resting within the walls beyond. The Vatican stands as a symbol of faith, authority, and guardianship, but it is also the keeper of countless secrets. We have traced the journey from the clay tablets of Sumer to the hidden hymns of Enki, to the star charts and forgotten texts quietly stored under lock and key. We have seen how knowledge can be controlled, edited, and delayed, how obedience can be cultivated through silence, and how the flow of history itself may have been adjusted to fit a narrative. And now we are here, at the threshold, facing the gates that guard the archives where the past sleeps. The question is not whether there is anything to fear, it is whether there is anything to reveal. If the Church holds only what is harmless, if the manuscripts preserved in darkness contain nothing that challenges faith, nothing that rewrites timelines, then open the vaults. Let the light shine on the words of the ancients, on the hymns of Enki, on the star maps, and the instructions meant to awaken the human mind. Let scholars, historians, and the curious see what has been kept away for centuries. But if the silence persists, if the doors remain closed, then it is impossible not to wonder, what is hidden? Who decides what is safe to know? And who benefits from a world that believes it sees the whole story while only glimpsing fragments? We do not claim certainty. There are gaps in knowledge, anomalies that scholars debate, and hypotheses that challenge conventional timelines. But certainty is not the goal here. The goal is transparency. The greatest danger is not a text, a symbol, or even a lost tablet. The greatest danger is the absence of questions. When no one dares to ask, when curiosity is silenced by fear or assumed authority, secrets can grow unchecked. The gates of Street Peters are more than stone and iron. They are a threshold between knowledge and ignorance, between light and carefully measured shadow. To stand here is to confront the legacy of centuries, the weight of power, and the potential for truth, to reshape the story we tell ourselves about who we are, where we came from, and what we might yet become. The vaults may contain answers, or they may remain a test of patience and persistence. What matters is that the question exists. What matters is that we keep asking. The most dangerous secret is the one no one thinks to ask about, the one that survives in silence because curiosity was never allowed to touch it. And so we leave the steps of Street Peters not with certainty, but with resolve. Keep the question alive. Follow the breadcrumbs through history, through the tablets, through the echoes of Enki's wisdom. Observe, inquire, and do not let the silence become your answer. The gates are closed, but the search for truth continues. The story is unfinished, and the next question may yet open the way.